the Brea sector. And we have one of our, if you haven't been to any of the seminar series, we basically have roughly one or so per month. Overarching theme this year is really multiple approaches to aging, and we're partnering with a number of other centers and initiatives across the campus. And today, the seminar that will be given by Laura Tamblyn Watts is partnered with the International Network on Critical Gerontology, which is a network that I run of scholars who are thinking about contemporary issues, critical questions, that sort of thing. So I won't take Laura's time because she may need some of the some complex issues, so she may need the time. What we generally do is about 40 minutes max of a presentation, followed by a discussion, raising hands, that sort of thing, questions that you might have. And I think we have the room until 2:30. Right. Okay. So today, Laura Tamblyn Watts, we're pleased that you could come and join us. Happy to be here. And Laura, just to give you a couple of sketches, before Laura moved to Toronto, she was the National Director at the Canadian Centre for Elder Law. Her area is aging and law, and a number of the kind of complexities involved there. She's been working with the NICE network in Toronto, which is the National Institute for Care of the Elderly, during knowledge translation with a number of practice groups, and she's editor of a number of peer-reviewed journals, including Journal Elder Abuse and Neglect, and co-facilitator of the World Study Group on Elder Law. So today, and currently pursuing, I know, yeah, well, it's the thing you don't want me to mention, currently pursuing her doctorate and teaching at the University of Toronto on law and aging. And I'll turn the tables over to you.
Thanks very much. The teaching's never the problem.
No, exactly.
Welcome and thanks for coming. I'll try to make sure that your lunchtime is entertaining. We are talking about sex, which is fun. Some of the times we're going to be talking about sexual consent, which is still fun. I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual abuse, which is not fun, but no trigger warnings. You don't get any of my ugly pictures or the nasty videos on this. I'm talking at kind of a high level with regards to some of those issues. And so, when we're talking about sexual consent, the narrative that we've had for many, many years has been sort of the no means no narrative, and it tends to be quite youth-oriented. When I say youth-oriented, I'm getting older, so I still include myself in that category, but really not much anymore. But it is really, and I'll be gendered about it, it's a young woman's narrative. It may be a child narrative, it may be a man's narrative, but if we're looking at the meta-narrative, it tends to be a youth and woman narrative around the issue of sexual consent. What we don't see as much is this woman. Her name is Diane, and this was a case from Witchwood, which is a long-term care facility. Some of you may remember this case. Diane, I think, is still quite young. She's only 71 years old, but she did have significant dementia, and she was sexually assaulted in her long-term care home more than one time by a carer in the home. So we think of that when we think of sexual consent. That's not what comes to our mind as much. And even less does it come to our mind, this lovely couple here. And this is a well-publicized American case of a man who was in fact a legislator. He was a sort of pillar of the community. And he was involved in a second marriage, and that second marriage kind of plays into the narrative because the children of his second wife brought charges, 3 counts of felony sexual assault against him. And this went all the way to trial. And the allegations were that he had sexual relations with his wife, she had dementia, and the allegations were at the time of the sexual conduct, she didn't have the capacity to consent. In that case, in the end, he was actually acquitted of the charge, but it was a very complicated charge, and it destroyed his life. And there had never been any sort of previous allegations of abuse. There was nothing in the marriage or the relationship that had any hint of a previous concern. So it was really about, could she consent to sex at the time with her husband, who by all intents and purposes she loved and was fond of and wanted intimacy with in some way at that time. Unsurprisingly, it was the children of her first marriage who brought the allegations forward and money was at stake. So when we think about sexual consent questions, I'm going to ask us to think broadly around sexual consent across the life course. It's impossible to talk about this area unless we talk about 3 other things. So I'm going to do a bit of a flying tour through these in our time together now. I'd love to come back and talk about any one of those more encapsulatingly at a different time, but you will forgive me as I do a little fly through these areas. And the first is we're going to talk a little bit about what consent capacity is. And it doesn't matter if it's the young person's consent, in the case of the younger woman with the no means no sign. It doesn't matter if it's the case of Diane in the long-term care facility, or in this case, the husband and wife there. It's consent to do anything, and we're going to talk about what that means. We're going to talk a little bit, very, very briefly, about domestic violence and sexual violence in later life as a phenomenon that we don't hear about much, and what's happening around that particular area right now, both in real life, but also in the literature and the studies. And then we're going to also talk a little bit about the criminal and other responses that can happen in this case. I gave you a little bit of a taste in the 2 cases with the older women that there were responses. When we're talking about long-term care, in this particular talk in particular, that frames our conversation because there's specific rules for things in long-term care that there's not in the broader community. It's a little bit easier to talk about this topic in long-term care because of the constraints, the legislation, the oversight that exists. It's much more difficult, by factors more difficult, in someone's own home or in a retirement home, which is part of a residential tenancy. I tell my students, please, 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 do not start your papers telling me that there's an age wave or a demographic tsunami or zombies of people in dementia coming forward, or my most hideous one, that the population of Canada is rapidly aging. The population of Canada is not rapidly aging. We are rapidly aging at the exact same rate that we were yesterday. We will age at the exact same rate that we will age tomorrow. It is not different. It's not like we didn't know this was going to happen. We just didn't talk about it, or we didn't deal with it. And I'm just going to show you the dementia impacts very briefly, because I am talking about sexual issues within the context of dementia. So how big an issue is this going to be? So you can see some of the statistics there. We're doubling our dementia numbers and tripling our dementia numbers. This one's quite interesting, I think, because within a generation, we're going to have 756 million caregiving hours predicted. Within one generation, that's not very far. And where are those hours of caregiving going to come from? It's not going to be paid caregiving. It's going to be more what we would call informal caregiving or caregiving amongst family and friends. Well, remember the case about the husband and wife? So when we're thinking about carers, we're also thinking about people who have other relationships besides being a caregiver. You're a daughter, you're a son, you're a friend, you're a neighbor, you're a member of a faith community, and so on. So the complexities of these relationships and caregiving are kind of getting mushed together. That makes it difficult, because if you put yourself in a position of power over someone, and a caregiver arguably may have power over the person who's dependent to them, changes your power dynamic, doesn't it? Particularly if we're adding in sexual intimacy, because now we're getting a power control dynamic that may not have been there before. So it's changing our thinking when we're thinking about the critical gerontology. I'm a visual person, so I like to see it. That number, that's the dementia number. And it also indicates the fact that our oldest are growing. You know, when I saw that Diane was 71, she barely even registered for me. Wait till you're 91, then come back to me. When I'm starting to think about older adults, our narrative, what is an older adult, is really shifting as well. So it is important to know that we're having more people live longer with increased frailty. But it doesn't mean that they don't want to engage in intimacy and sexuality, quite the contrary. So, quick shot of the government. Our government is changing, but the government has also known about our needs to have greater laws in this area, our needs to have greater understanding in this area, our needs to have greater research in this area. And yet, when Amanda asked me, what do you want to talk about that's a cutting issue or an issue on the edge, I said I want to talk about dementia and sexuality and long-term care, because we don't have a national dementia strategy. we don't have a national long-term care strategy, and we don't like to talk about sex. So that's why we're talking about it here, so thank you. So this is my really quick and dirty explanation about capacity. And I'm using the word capability here, or capacity here, on an interchangeable basis. People get really fussed about the words. We use both of these words in different contexts to mean essentially the same thing. If you look at American literature, they'll talk about competence. In the end, what we're trying to see is if a person has the ability to understand information and appreciate the consequences. You have to do both. So if you had a client with schizophrenia and you said, tell me about schizophrenia, and they rattled off the DSM-5 explanation of schizophrenia for you, and then said, tell me about your schizophrenia, and they said, I don't have schizophrenia, except they've been treated for schizophrenia for 30 years, they have the ability to understand data, but not appreciate it. My grandmother, when she had dementia, when she was in her mid-90s, she had long-standing blood sugar issues. She needed to have her blood tested for her sugars. Happened for 50 years, was not new. The nurse would come with the needle to prick her, and she'd do this. She appreciated that someone was going to prick her with a needle or do something that was going to be uncomfortable to her. But she didn't understand why. She couldn't make the decision about whether or not her treatment would, because she didn't both understand and appreciate. And it's within a context. So you don't just generally understand and appreciate something, it has to be about it. So you can turn it on and off. And that's how we used to think about capacity. In the old mental lunacy laws, right? You were either capable of everything or incapable of everything. And that meant your decisions around finance, that your decisions around health, your decisions around just about anything that made you a free person. We have a real stat model, you know, we think about temperatures turning up and turning down. We're only supposed to reduce your rights, restrict those to the degree that they're necessary. So very often the first thing that will go would be higher level functioning around numbers. So if that's the case, then maybe one of the first things that happens for testing for capacity, if someone needs support, is you might need some kind of substitute decision maker to help you with maybe finance. But you may be able to do your regular everyday finance, and it may have nothing to do with your health and personal care decisions or your housing decisions, okay? So this is my quick and dirty. So what does it mean? So a capable person can understand, appreciate, and evaluate the data. And again, it's all about the degrees. So anyone here who's ever maybe had more than one alcoholic beverage in a night? Right? You are able to do some things at the beginning of the night that maybe you can't do at the end of the night. Walk in a straight line, drive your car, decide which is the better bottle of wine to order. You can understand and appreciate some things and not others. I had a couple of kids really close together in age. I don't think I could understand and appreciate anything before my third cup of coffee at 10 in the morning, right? So degrees of fluctuation. I don't ever take opiate meds. Maybe you've had some codeine or something like that, or post-surgical, or a urinary tract infection. All of these things can affect your capacity, but they fluctuate in time. Now, a person who's in a coma has, as you can imagine, the lowest level of capacity. Although there was a did you see that? There was an article yesterday of a guy who woke up from a coma for 12 years. It turns out he's been listening to the whole thing the whole time. So, I mean, even in that most dramatic circumstance, apparently there was some understanding, a very difficult way to explain it. So, when we're talking about capacity to consent to things, and in this context, I'm going to narrow our down to capacity to consent to sex, it's about decision capacity. The mental ability to decide, not your body's ability to do it. So when we talk about functional capacity, we'll talk about, you know, can you get up and walk across the room? Can you go grocery shopping? In this case, can you physically engage with sexuality in some fashion with your body? That's a functional assessment about it. I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about whether you can understand and appreciate that. And testing awareness of limitations is part of assessment of capacity. So if you're trying to figure out whether somebody can have, in this case, sexual relations with you, you have to kind of be able to see, you know, is the person conscious? Remember, think back into the youth narrative of you know, date rape, drugs, and drinking, and so on. Are they conscious? Do they know who you are? Are they oriented? You can't have sex that's consensual if there are those kinds of limitations. And it's really important, this is a hard distinction in law to explain, but let me use my children as an example. It's not about whether or not people do understand it, it's whether they have the ability to understand it. Let me take you to my front hall. I have 3 children. They are 12, 13, and 14. Amongst them, they have 400 pairs of shoes and 79 backpacks. You know what I'm talking about. You walk in, and you know what happens, right? There's all the hooks, there's all the cubbies, there's all the good place to put your things. Do any of the shoes go away? Do any of the cubbies get filled with backpacks? Does any of that happen? No. Woof! Every single time you walk in. And I say to the kids, guys, if you don't hang up your coats, if you don't put away your backpacks, if you don't put away your shoes, Mommy's going to lose her mind. No one likes it when Mommy loses her mind. Oh, yes, we know it's a bad idea, right? Does it happen? Next day, they walk in. What happens, right? End of school. Woof, the backpacks, the shoes. Guys, you understand. Now, I believe my children have the ability to understand and appreciate that this is a bad thing and makes Mommy psychotic. But they don't do it, okay? But they could make the decision if they wanted to. So think about when we're talking about sex, the ability to understand it. So it's not whether or not someone will consent or nodding or acquiescence. A lot of those things have to do with power and control. This is a big topic. We can talk about planning for future care. We can talk about advanced care planning. We can talk about powers of attorney and all that good stuff. I'm going to give you the quickest version of that. If you're a capable adult, you get to make your decisions. If you're in that coma, you're an incapable adult, someone else is going to make a decision for you. And this is your fluctuating capacity, okay? This is the theory. You cross the street, you get hit by the bus, you're in the coma, you need someone else to make a decision for you. Ordinarily, when we're having this conversation, we talk about things like personal health care choices. Someone's got to make a decision for you if you've got dementia, you're in long-term care, you need a health care treatment, or you need some changes to your medical condition or a personal care need, or maybe you need to move to a different place. And we have in law this great list of who gets to be the trump card person to make that decision about health and personal care decisions. Someone will decide. Either you've got a court-ordered guardian, it's unlikely, you may have previously made a power of attorney for personal care. It's about 30% of us. We have this consent capacity board tribunal. Maybe someone was appointed to do that there. And if not, there's that default list that you kind of think of. Your spouse, your kids, your siblings, and so on. So my point is not to go through this, but just to say health and personal care decisions, someone's going to decide for you. Okay? Financial and property decisions. Okay, the decisions are a little bit limited. Most people don't realize there's no default list for substitute decision making for finance. So either you got a court order, it's rare, it's expensive, power of attorney that you've already made, 30% of us, okay. Narrow area, there could be a decision around the consent capacity board, but they mostly don't deal with that. Or then you're handing off to the public guardian trustee. They're going to try to find someone to do it. Probably someone like a spouse or a partner or a children or something like that. But there's no default list. And that's for money. So this is what happens to your health and personal. This is what happens to your money. This is what happens with sex. There's no substitute decision making for sex. You can't decide that you're going to have sexual intimacy as when you're a capable person for when you're incapable. Coma is an easy example. You can't do that. But the fluctuating capacity around something like a dementia, very different. You may have sundowning. You may be very capable in the morning. You may not be so good in the afternoon. In the morning, you would be able. Maybe you're an early morning person. That's a good time for you, right? But in the afternoon, not so much in the afternoon and evening, no. There's no substitute decision making for sexual intimacy, and yet it's a fundamental part. It's not a healthcare decision. It's not a personal care decision under our definition. It's only something that you can consent to yourself. This is a very difficult case. The thing is, in law, we talk about hard cases make bad law. hard case, difficult law. This is a case about sexual bondage, I'm not joking, sexual bondage in the course of a very terrible divorce. And the Legal Education Action Fund, which is a great organization, it's a feminist law organization. We advance the issues of women's rights and very proud of doing that. They took this case up, and I have to say I'm grateful on some levels, but in my area, in law and aging, it makes for a very difficult circumstance. Clear, but difficult. Clear in law, difficult in practice. Supreme Court of Canada wrote, and this is very interesting, it was written by the Chief Justice, so it has the sort of strongest imprimatur of the court, the strongest voice. And the Chief Justice wrote, Parliament's definition of consent does not extend to advance consent to sexual acts committed while the complainant is unconscious. This was a case of consensual asphyxiation. It was consensual. This was a long-term practice that they had engaged in. There was no concern. She had consented to the practice. But the argument was there was a point where she had blanked out and that the practice should have stopped at that point. It was a case of a very messy divorce. And this was one of the wedge issues that was used. But it was a unique point in law. Later on in the decision, the Chief Justice continues by saying, the legislation requires ongoing conscious consent to ensure that women and men are not the victims of sexual exploitation and to ensure that individuals engaging in sexual activity are capable of asking their partners to stop at any point. So even though she had engaged in consensually, was absolutely 100% behind this thing, there was a point where she did black out, and that was the reasonable and foreseeable consequence of their action. That had happened before, she knew that it happened before, but this point of law came up and said, I wasn't able to give you consent. It's a narrow point of law. Okay, and you know what, the feminist in me is thinking, yeah, that's great, I don't want date rape drugs. Yes, I want to make sure that that power relationship is always something that we're notable on. Good. I like this theory. Except how exactly are you supposed to know if you have someone with dementia, with fluctuating capacity, whether or not they can at all times consent? What does consent look like to a person in dementia? And the risks are both criminal and regulatory, as well as civil. And in the case of the gentleman that I told you about, life-destroying. And that was a case of what you consider innocent. There was no sort of malicious attack. To have this conversation go farther, we have to confront the notion of sexual abuse of older adults, which is one of these very, very rarely discussed issues and happens a lot more than we'd like to talk about. And so when we're talking about sexual abuse and abuse generally, what we know is that if you are a capable adult, you can make foolish decisions. You can make risky decisions. And the case of J.A., where she was engaged in asphyxiation, consensual asphyxiation, is a risky thing to do. It stops you breathing. Breathing is important. It helps that whole metabolism thing work. But she was able to do it because she had capacity to make that decision before she blacked out. But when is a person supposed to be able to achieve consent? Well, Chief Justice said, at all times during the act, whatever the act is. I don't think we mean hand-holding, but it's more than that. But sexual touching is included into that. So maybe for some people, hand-holding might include sexual touching. And how are we supposed to assess this? Particularly if there's an ongoing relationship, as opposed to kind of a one-time thing or a concern of abuse. Some forms of sexual abuse. We've got, things that look a lot like physical abuse. We've got things that are not looking like physical abuse, touching without consent. Doesn't look like a physical abuse. It doesn't necessarily leave a mark, but it can be. Yesterday, I was able to give an entire education session at the Toronto Police College on domestic violence in later life, and I showed them videos. And they're enormously impactful and dramatic. And what I want to say is, when it comes to sexual abuse, you know, there are many indicators that can be seen as other things. People say older people bruise easily. Well, we actually have an excellent bruising study by Dr. Laura Mosqueda at the UC Irvine Center for Elder Abuse and Neglect, which is evidence-based and has been used successfully to measure certain bruises in older adults, particularly around physical and sexual abuse. So the idea of just because they're bruised, you know, we can't figure it out. No, we can. But other things like broken assistive devices and untreated injuries, these are all red flags for physical as well as sexual abuse. Also, marks behind the ears and on the eyes and under a wig for a woman are areas where people don't often look with regards to sexual abuse. And sexual abuse in later life can be part of a long-going status of intimate partner violence. They may have abuse grown old. It may be a life of abuse. I had a client, I'll call her Mary. She was engaged in a long-term relationship with her husband, more than 50 years. They were devout Catholics. She was not going to leave him. They lived in a rural community. It was just not part of the culture. And when he died, and she called my clinic because her son was coming in, and her son was trying to steal her things, and eventually also engaged in sexual abuse of his mother. You know, she called up my clinic, and she'd said to the patient I had answering the phone, my husband has passed away. And what, of course, do we train to say? What do we say? I'm so sorry. And she said, it's the best day of my life. We have a power control wheel you may be familiar with in terms of, again, youth or younger sexual violence, what we're talking about. We also use a power control wheel on abuse in later life. There are some similarities, but some of them are different as well. And so, you know, as an example, in younger women in particular, it may be threats to the child. In older adults, it may be threats to pets. It may be threats to access of grandchildren. It may be threats in order to take something out, like exchange of sexual favors in order to go to your faith group or your hairdresser. There's many, many points on this, and again, we could talk about this. But I really want to talk about the fact that it is when we say it's a rising trend, the sheer numbers will make it a rising trend. It doesn't have to increase in terms of a new type of engagement. The sheer volume that we saw will make sexual abuse of older adults a rising trend. And I mean, what we also know is that in long-term care homes, we have fairly rampant STDs now. And it's a huge issue. HIV, AIDS, we've got venereal diseases we haven't seen in a while for any number of reasons. One of them is that they may not have grown up with that kind of conversation around sexual health. They may not be exposed to supports to help keep people safe, like condoms and other types of supports and uses. And there may also be resident you may call it abuse or aggression or violence or behavioral issues. One or another, one of our biggest issues is older adults on other older adults, both of whom have some form of cognitive impairment. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's both. Well, sexual assault is somebody doing this, but if you don't have the ability to understand and appreciate your own actions, you don't have the mens rea. You have to have in law mens rea and actus reus. You have to have the intention and mental intention to do something, and then you have to do it. What we're seeing with my colleagues at Crown Council, older adults, often men, not always, but often men, being dragged in front of him in chains, proverbially, out of long-term care and into his courtroom, and he says, what am I supposed to do with this older adult who has hypersexuality pursuant to dementia and frontal lobe impairment? Yes, he sexually assaulted this other person, but he doesn't understand and appreciate his actions. Is he not mentally capable? That's what we use when we're talking about things like mental health issues. Is it mental health? Not really. Kind of. What do we do with these people? Are we going to lock them up? No, they can't go into jail. They don't have the ability to be in the population of jail. Do you know where they go? Long-term care. That's what they do. They come back into the population of long-term care. Except, you now have this terrible thing on your chart which says that you're a sexual predator, which means many long-term care facilities won't take you. Is it that the person was engaged as a sexual predator, or is it that they had hypersexuality pursuant to dementia and are in long-term care where there's all kinds of people around? That's one really good question. We just don't have really any answers. I said at the beginning that actually being in long-term care makes it actually a bit easier, more than a bit easier. If it's a husband and wife, it's a husband and husband. If it's a grandmother and grandson and they're in the community behind closed doors, there's no regulation of that. You don't really want regulation of that. In long-term care facility, it's a highly structured environment. And the Ontario Long-Term Care Act, which was passed in 2007, is a very modern piece of legislation and highly prescriptive. I make my students get a copy of it, it's this big, and the regulations are about this big, and I make them go through it. And being such a highly regulated environment, it actually has specific laws on it, that specific regulations, pardon me, about mandatory reporting, and sexual abuse or sexual assault reporting is in there as well. I said the third term we'll talk about the regulations and the laws. We can't forget the criminal code. I mentioned very briefly that my colleague in Crown Counsel is starting to kind of rest his hands. But whether or not somebody is engaged as a sexual predator, somebody is not understanding the ability to understand and communicate with somebody with dementia, who, by the way, may look and mask perfectly well, but afterwards may curl up and cry. Is the person able to rely on their assessment by having a conversation, being able to speak to the person all the way, but then afterwards, if you hear the sobs from the room, are you to infer that the sobs are related to the sexual contact? Or is the short-term memory loss kicking in? And are they mourning the loss of physical intimacy that they just had? We can't assume that the sobs come from a sense of abuse or violation. They may come from a sense of loneliness and withdrawn. There may be a positive affect to that sociology. This is the fundamental principle in long-term care, that it is the home of an older adult, which means that sexual freedom should be part of that experience. But again, we have sexual exploitations with persons with disabilities. So we have, whether or not you have any type of sexual exploitation, we have specific charges with people with disabilities. Everyone in long-term care has a disability, or they're not going to be in long-term care, particularly these days. And they probably have multiple disabilities. So your risks of having sexual relationships with somebody with a disability only turns on whether or not they can fully consent, and whether or not there's a power dynamic of a caregiving or perceived power which may influence that. It's fraud. I want to just remind you, there's no pre-consent. It does not matter. In the case of JA, it was moment to moment. She couldn't pre-consent 3 seconds later. You certainly can't draft a document that says, I love my partner, I love my relationship with my partner, I love my physical relationship with my partner, and when I have dementia and am living in long-term care, I want to make sure that I'm able to best explore my physicality and sexual intimacy with my partner. And you can't have someone else do it for you. We talked about that. So where are you? Well, you're alone. I mean, the safest thing that can ever happen is to make sure nobody ever touches you. Well, what we know in dementia is that intimacy is an enormously important part, and touch can play an important part as well, positive touching. I've just posted this up here to show that there's some research being done, and there's some analysis being done about what this is like. And there's an American institution of long-term care, the Hebrew Home, which is really leading the conversation around sexual consent policies and so on. But don't the people have rights? Did I just say you can never have sex in long-term care if there's any hint of dementia? Kind of, yeah. Except that the resident has the right to be courteous, they have the right to communicate, have visitors of their choice, be in private with their visitors. Indeed, long-term care homes have an obligation to provide private and intimate space for parties to be engaged in whatever kind of intimacy they want to be engaged in. It's part of it comes out of our disabilities narrative, right? It comes out of the notion that people with disabilities should have access to privacy, even in institutional care, to express sexuality. There's bits and pieces of research that are happening, but it's really, really tough here on the edge. It's hard to get sexual predators to talk to you, first of all. It's hard to get elder sexual predators to talk to you. You can't really talk easily to people who are engaged in having sexual relationships which are consent or consenting confused, because they may not even know what you're talking about. And in one particular case where they did confront an older man who was having a relationship, in this case with another woman who was in long-term care, he was devastated to find out the fact that people thought that he was abusing this woman, and he thought that he was in a very loving relationship with her. Devastated. So what do we do? I don't know. We're here on the edge. What I know is that the law of JA, the case that we had in the Supreme Court of Canada, is the law, and it's sort of unlikely to change. Except that's not how we live as an aging population. And it doesn't speak to how we're supposed to live in dementia. And it doesn't speak to the generational shift of carers and how people who are carers are supposed to either help support a person engage in physical intimacy and sexual relationship. Because you are, as a carer, supposed to help and support and do all these good things. At the same time, you may be conflicted, because if you're the person that would be having a sexual relationship with that, you're changing your relationship from maybe exploiting your position of power as a carer from a previous relationship where you may have had a positive sexual notion. You know what's easy? Diane's easy. Diane's easy and terrible. Someone comes in with cognitive impairment in long-term care, the other person comes in who has no cognitive impairment, he's an employee, he's younger, and he's a sexual predator. I know what to do with him. But I know what to do with him because it falls under the youth narrative. He's a younger person. We know about domestic violence, we know about sexual assault, we know about disability assault. I don't know what to do with the husband and wife, though. Because in that case, as we can see, it's really going to be everyone's difficulty. I think I'm right on time.
Thank you so much. Please join me in the round of a fantastic troubling of kind of where we are right now and what do we do. So I'm sure that members of the audience have.
It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual consent. If you've got capacity questions or powers of attorney questions, bring those out too. No problem at all. Happy to answer anything about that. Yep.
As thick as the Long-Term Care Home Act and regs are and how thorough they are, they don't really help the long-term care homes to know what to do.
Nope.
So they always err on the side of calling in the police. And in the regs it says, you know, you have to call in the police if what you've seen constitutes a criminal act. So is there intent?
Yep.
But you can't expect a director of care and PSWs and nurses to be able to figure that out. And they've found out that if they call the police, they never get in trouble with the ministry. If they don't call the police, they often get in trouble with the ministry. So it makes them very risk averse.
Absolutely.
And what it means is that the daily life of people who could have some affection with each other is really negatively affected.
Absolutely.
So I, after many years of working in this field, haven't a clue what to do.
That's good for me to hear, actually, because I don't either. And as I say, I've been teaching the police, and I spent most of yesterday talking about sexual assault and dementia and sexual abuse in later life and DV in later life and all the versions around them. And again, they're very comfortable with youth sexual assault. When I say youth, I really mean kind of anyone under, let's call it 65, I consider them youth, right? When younger people, they know what to do. And cognitive impairment is not even a problem. They know what to do with cognitive impairment in that area, because it tends to be drugs or alcohol or power and control or something like that. They know what to do with that. But you bring in a long-term care and you bring in a dementia, and they don't know what to do. And part of it is a lot of police actually also just don't feel comfortable in the long-term care space. It's a space that feels uncomfortable, and it's kind of a place out of time as well. And they also, those who do know very well there's no place to put those people. So if they're going to charge them, they're going to be bad witnesses, probably, unless we have the case where you have the one person who's being exploited, like that, the second case of Diane. That one they know what to do with, and boy, they'll go for those ones. But dementia, they're really lost. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. I agree with all the points you've raised, and I agree with Deb that this is a very challenging issue for clinicians. A number of us are here because this is a continual issue for us in the real world of long-term care practice. And I would have to state that the difficulty for us is the absolute statement about consent being at this level. What Lichtenberg would tell us is it's an MMSE score of 14 or below, which when you speak to him, he tells me that that's an arbitrary number that he picked out of the air.
It's good to know. I've always wondered about that. Actually, I have a slide that I could have actually put that slide in. I have a slide with all of the different ways that you can distill, and 14 is there, the different ones. And I've always wondered, how did they get those numbers? So,
it was arbitrary.
Got it.
Many of us would know in the clinical world, again, you can score 5 or below and still have absolutely remarkable capacity to navigate your world. And indeed, residents will tell us continuously, I don't want that food. I don't want that food. I don't want that food. And yet somehow we say that there's no capacity that they have to say bugger off if somebody comes and tries to lift their skirt up and put their hand between this person's legs. These are things that make it very difficult for us. And there's a moral trump that we could all go, phew, 14 or less. We don't have to even worry about this now. So the book is closed. They shall never meet again. And he is going to be transferred to HPH.
Yep.
And she, the poor, vulnerable older adult, because we all know women never ask for sex.
Gendering is huge in this piece.
It is, and also for the frontline staff. Because if they're the ones that have to live with this day by day, then they don't want to be charged. And the other issue is when the police come in, because we have to call, the police will say, you cannot speak to me. I don't want to know anything about this because I am now doing a criminal investigation and I'm not interested in anything that you have to say as a clinical nurse specialist or the director of care because you will prejudice this investigation. So I'm not interested in anything you have to say.
I'm back
which
at the police tomorrow. I'll tell them, I'll pass
very
that along.
difficult. It becomes problematic.
Hugely problematic. And building on what you're saying, it's very personal, it's very good. I do have a slide that tells you all the different kind of vaguely, I always figured somewhat arbitrary versions of why and how you can consent. One of them is a test based on location to time and space. Well, I don't know about you, but location to time and space doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not, I can consent to sexual intimacy or not. Numbers that I would score. And just imagine, I mean to be a little bit lighthearted on this one because it's such a difficult subject. But exactly how would we do this in practice? Imagine, if you will, the lovely couple or groups of people, who are we to say that only one? There's a great group in New Zealand that tried to get kicked out of long-term care by hosting an orgy. They actually did. It was fantastic. They got written up too. They were going to be thrown out of long-term. They had a full-on orgy. And they posted an orgy, like Wednesday at 2 p.m., there'll be pizza. Like it was the whole thing. I'm not joking. And I was like right on. And I don't know what it says about me, but I had like 10 people send me that article. There was booze. get an MMSC, God forbid, right? Ask, can you please draw a clock? Can you count backwards by 7? I can't count backwards by 7 now, right? Anyway, the sort of logistics. Now let's take the idea of JA, where we had a husband and wife, married, long-term relationship, established sexual preferences, clear consent all the way through, and the court held that the period of time where she understood and appreciated and knew that she would pass out, having, in this case, I think she put the rope around her own neck. So let's be clear, the law is black and white. How in the case of people who have some form of cognitive impairment, and it may be moderate, or how are you going to have that conversation all the way through? How can you ever trust it? And I agree with you. When we look at the different, I try to avoid saying there's levels of capacity or levels of consent, because it's really more tests for it. You know, in law, one of the highest, quote, tests for capacity that you have to have, the highest sort of functioning of understanding and appreciating, really has to do with your financial investments. I mean, that's actually one of the ones where, and testamentary capacity is sort of below that, and so on. Powers of attorney kind of in the middle, right? One of the very lowest ones is capacity to marry. That doesn't mean you can't be sexually abused in marriage. Of course, we all know that you can. Do you know what's more difficult than getting married for capacity? Getting divorced. So you can get married, but not get divorced. So when I think about sort of the challenges of where sexual consent lies, it's in law down here, you would think, except it's not. So you can get married, but not have sex. Okay, that's fine. I mean, I'm not saying that, but there's often a common understanding that sexual intimacy will come with a marriage, except the capacity to consent to sex is way up here. It's complex. Other thoughts? Yes, please.
It's a bit of an afterthought, but have you ever heard of a rabbi from the States that instituted or conceived of aging to saging? And he's now deceased. He died in the summer, but I've watched his little sermons on YouTube. And he speaks of intimacy within the nursing homes because it comes up in his conversations often. And he refers it to, we shouldn't worry too much about it. It's really older people trying to seek comfort with one another, and maybe that's how we should look at it generally. But it seems too simplistic after what you tell me.
I mean, it's hard because it depends which way you cut it, right? What's seeking comfort for one person may not be comfortable upon the recipient. There has to be two people. You can seek comfort yourself, and that's okay. But as long as you're seeking sexual comfort with somebody else, you have to make sure that they're fully able to, in law, understand and appreciate it. Please.
I'm really interested also in the notion of all the way. Because in the long-term care sector with aging adults, their polymorbidities, the medications that they're on, I'll be frank here, plug your ears if you don't want to hear what I'm going to say, and that is the likelihood of penetrative vaginal intercourse is actually quite low in the majority of older adults that are living currently in long-term care. And so by talking about it as though this is going to be what happens causes a lot of upset and fear amongst point of care staff because they're afraid of the rape word. And if that happens on their watch, that is a criminal act. But the likelihood of unclothed bodies rubbing together, caressing, that's more likely what's going to happen without any injury to either party. And comfort can exist with, and is part of relationships and also comfort. So that again becomes very difficult. For those of you here, if you could imagine being a point of care staff, a PSW, what are you supposed to do? Stand at the door and watch and go, okay, that's it.
And you're not allowed to do that either, because of course you have the rights and your residence bills of rights, so you're not allowed, you're betwixt and between. And yet we know, and just building on your point, that the criminal code would have the two naked people sexually exploring. That is sexual touching, and it would. We don't have rape in law anymore. We just have sexual assault, and sexual assault can have degrees of severity to it, but it still falls under sexual assault. Thank you. That's very helpful. Yes.
Are there any examples of like training for care workers around sexual consent and also just other abuse in general?
We're starting. Okay, so. Whether I think it's good. Is there some? There's some. Whether I think it's good might be a different question. I think right now probably the best training is out of the Hebrew home in New York. And I can provide that to you if you'd like to circulate that around. I do also have a paper as well which can be circulated if you like with links and so on in that. We do have some training. The Ontario College of Social Work and Social Service Work has kind of been thinking around how to deal with this. PSWs are asking, is there any standardized sets of competencies? Not that I'm aware of. And there's certainly nothing, I mean, in terms of our legal colleagues, because remember, the lawyers get called, whether it's the lawyers for the long-term care facility or the lawyers for the person or the Crown Counsel, law's all around this thing, right? Whether it's a liability question or a criminal question or a planning question. And we have sort of taken it above ourselves to try to come up with things, but our law doesn't fit, as my colleague in the back said, our law doesn't really fit the realities and the comforts and the needs. So is there some? Yes. My colleague Judith Wall at the Advocacy Center for the Elderly has given some talks. I've given some talks. The police are asking for training. But in terms of core competencies of care staff, at this point it does seem predominantly institution by institution, home by home. There doesn't seem to be any cutting competencies that are specifically targeted and I'm aware of at least. And if there are, I'd love to hear about them. Please.